Sometimes the greatest strength comes from protecting what others would destroy. Sometimes the deepest love grows in the harshest places. In 1882 New Mexico territory, Bo Laramie inherited his dead brother's ranch and found something unexpected among the property, a woman named Amara, who was supposed to be his slave. The town expected him to use her like every other man had. Instead, he gave her freedom, her own room, and gentle hands that carried her each night. But when word spread that the feared giant cowboy had gone soft, dangerous men came calling. They wanted to take back what they believed belonged to them. They didn't know that some men will burn the whole world down before they let anyone harm the woman they love. What happens when a town built on cruelty faces a man willing to die for kindness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust devil that swept across the Esperanza Valley that August morning carried with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Bo Laramie stood 6 feet 8 inches in his worn leather boots, a giant among men, even in a territory where size often meant survival. His hands, scarred from years of ranch work and bar fights, held the crumpled inheritance letter that had arrived 3 days after they buried his brother Caleb in the rocky ground behind the old church. The letter was simple enough legal words that transferred ownership of 2,000 acres, 40 head of cattle, a ramshackle ranch house, and what the lawyer delicately termed additional property. Bo had ridden hard from Denver, expecting debts and creditors. What he found instead was a woman sitting on the front porch of the ranch house, mending a torn shirt with steady, practiced hands. She looked up when his shadow fell across her work, and Bo felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates finding new ground. Her eyes were the color of strong coffee, steady and unafraid, despite everything she must have endured. Her skin carried the golden warmth of Spanish heritage, mixed with something else, maybe Apache, maybe Puebloan. Her black hair was braided simply down her back. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen better years, and around her shoulders was draped a worn shawl that seemed to carry stories in every thread. "You must be Bo," she said, her voice carrying an education that surprised him. "I'm Amara." She didn't stand, didn't bow her head, didn't display any of the deference he'd expected. Instead, she continued her mending, as if his arrival was merely an interruption to more important work. The town of Esperanza stretched itself along the valley floor like a snake sunning on a rock. Adobe buildings hugged the dusty main street, their flat roofs and thick walls built to withstand the relentless New Mexico sun. The cantina sat on one end of town, its wooden doors swinging open to release the sounds of guitar music and rough laughter. On the other end stood the whitewashed church, where Father Miguel held services in both Spanish and English, trying to minister to souls that often seemed more interested in earthly pursuits than heavenly ones. Between these two poles of sin and salvation, the people of Esperanza conducted their daily business with the pragmatic acceptance of those who'd learned to survive in hard country. Sheriff Tom Bradley kept the peace with a worn Colt and the kind of weary authority that came from breaking up too many fights between men with too much whiskey and too little sense. The general store, run by a nervous man named Peterson, sold everything from flour to ammunition with equal efficiency and minimal conversation. But it was Clayton Morse who truly ruled this little corner of the territory. His ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres north of town, and his influence reached into every business, every conversation, every decision that mattered. A man in his 50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes, Morse had the kind of wealth that bought silence and the kind of power that demanded respect. When he rode into town on his black stallion, conversations stopped and people found urgent business elsewhere. Morse had history with the Laramie family, the kind of history that left scars and settled grudges. Caleb Laramie had done business with Morse, the sort of dark business that happened in the territory's shadows, where law was scarce and conscience scarcer. Now that Caleb was dead, Morse expected to collect on certain understandings, certain arrangements that had been made between men who lived outside the bounds of decent society. The ranch house itself told the story of the Laramie brothers' different paths. Caleb had let it fall into disrepair, more interested in quick money than lasting investments. The roof leaked in 2 places. The front steps sagged under even modest weight, and the barn door hung crooked on its hinges. But the bones of the place were solid, thick adobe walls that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, wide rooms with high ceilings and windows positioned to catch the morning light and evening breezes. Behind the house, a small cemetery held 3 weathered headstones. The newest bore Caleb's name and dates, along with words that were more hopeful than accurate: beloved, brother, and son. The other 2 markers were older, worn smooth by wind and weather until the names were barely readable. But Bo could make out enough letters to know they marked his parents' graves, the father who'd taught him that strength meant never backing down, and the mother who died too young to temper those harsh lessons with gentleness. It was in the shadow of these graves that Bo first began to understand what his inheritance truly meant. Amara had been working in a small garden plot, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil with the kind of patience that spoke of long experience with disappointment. She moved with quiet efficiency, her movements economical and purposeful. "How long have you been here?" Bo asked, removing his hat in the presence of the dead. 3 years, she replied, not looking up from the tomato plants she was staking. "Since your brother," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Since he acquired me." The word hung between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Acquired. Not hired, not married, not even seduced. Acquired, like a horse or a piece of furniture. Bo felt his jaw tighten with an anger that surprised him in its intensity. "What did he tell you about me?" Bo asked. This time she did look up, studying his face with those coffee-colored eyes. "He said you were the dangerous one, the one with the temper and the fast hands. He said if anything happened to him, you'd probably sell me south to work the cotton fields." Bo absorbed this character assessment from his dead brother and found it wanting. "What do you say?" A small smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first real expression he'd seen from her. "I say a man's reputation often travels faster than his truth. I also say 3 years is a long time to learn the difference between a man who hurts because he can and one who hurts because he doesn't know how to stop." The wisdom in her words hit him like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd survived 3 years, with his brother survived whatever cruelties Caleb had inflicted, and still possessed the clarity to see the difference between chosen evil and learned brutality. It made Bo wonder what she saw when she looked at him. That evening, as the sun painted the mesa walls red and gold, Bo found himself sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee that tasted better than any he'd made for himself in years. Amara had prepared a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and beef from the ranch's own cattle, seasoned with herbs from her garden. They'd eaten in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of understanding rather than awkwardness. "The town will expect certain things," Amara said finally, breaking the quiet that had settled between them like dust after a storm. "Such as, they'll expect you to use me as your brother did. They'll expect you to assert your ownership in ways that leave no doubt about my place in your household." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "They'll be watching to see if you're weak." Bo set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "And what do you expect?" For the first time since he'd arrived, he saw something vulnerable flicker across her features. "I expect nothing. Expectation is a luxury I gave up long ago. But I hope—" She stopped, shaking her head as if hope itself was dangerous. "You hope what?" "I hope you're not your brother." The simple honesty of it hit him harder than any blow he'd ever taken in a fight. Here was a woman who'd been treated as property, who'd been broken down and rebuilt in the image of someone else's convenience, and still she had room for hope. Still she believed that one man might be different from another. That night, Bo lay in his brother's Beddy's bed and stared at the ceiling while the desert wind whispered through the gaps in the adobe walls. Down the hall, Amara slept in what had been a storage room, on a narrow cot with a thin blanket. The arrangement spoke volumes about how his brother had viewed her place in the household. Tomorrow, Bo knew, he would ride into town and face the expectations that Amara had warned him about. He would meet Clayton Morse and the other men who'd done business with his brother. He would see the looks, hear the comments, feel the weight of a community's assumptions about what kind of man he was and what kind of life he intended to build. But tonight, in the darkness of a house that felt haunted by poor choices and missed opportunities, Bo Laramie made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of becoming a different kind of man than either his father or his brother had been. Tomorrow, he would start learning what it meant to use his strength to protect rather than to control. The worn shawl that Amara had draped over her shoulders seemed to shimmer in his memory like a flag of surrender that was actually a declaration of war against the kind of life that reduced human beings to property, war against the assumption that might made right, war against the part of himself that had been raised to believe that a man took what he wanted and held it through force. As sleep finally claimed him, Bo's last conscious thought was of coffee-colored eyes that held more strength than his giant's frame had ever possessed. The cellar door hadn't been opened in months, maybe years. Rust had claimed the iron hinges, and when Bo finally forced it open, the screech of metal on metal seemed to echo across the valley like a wounded animal's cry. He'd been looking for tools, anything that might help him repair the barn door that hung at such a dangerous angle. What he found instead changed everything he thought he knew about his brother. The steps descended into darkness thick as molasses. Bo struck a match and found an old oil lamp hanging from a nail driven into the adobe wall. The flame caught and threw dancing shadows across a room that told stories no decent man should know. Iron shackles hung from the walls, their metal worn smooth by use. A wooden table bore stains that could have been anything but probably weren't, and in the corner, coiled like a sleeping snake, lay a set of chains that had seen far too much service. Bo's hands shook as he lifted the shackles, feeling their weight and understanding their purpose. These weren't the restraints of justice or even the rough tools of cattle work. These were instruments of cruelty, designed to break spirits and bend wills. The iron was cold against his palms, but he felt heat rising in his chest, a furnace of anger that threatened to consume everything in its path. When he climbed back into the sunlight, Amara was hanging wash on the line behind the house. She took one look at his face and went very still, her hands frozen on a shirt that danced in the desert breeze. "You found his workshop," she said, not a question. Workshop. Bo spat the word like it tasted of poison. Is that what he called it? Amara's fingers resumed their work, but slower now, more careful. He called it many things. Workshop was the kindest. Did he? Bo couldn't finish the question. Didn't want to know the answer, but needed to all the same. Your brother was not a gentleman, Amara said, her voice steady as stone. But I survived him. That should tell you something about the strength we both possess. The rage that had been building in Bo's chest found its release in action. He stalked back to the cellar, gathered every piece of iron, every chain, every tool of torment he could find. The pile grew beside the house like an altar to cruelty. Then he stoked the forge that Caleb had used for shoeing horses and began feeding the flames. The iron glowed red, then white-hot. The chains writhed like living things as the fire consumed them. And with each piece that melted, Bo felt something inside himself, Changino, just anger burning away, but shame and complicity in a legacy he'd never chosen but had inherited all the same. Amara watched from the porch, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. When the last piece of metal had been reduced to slag, she walked to where he stood, covered in soot and sweat. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of gratitude. 2 days later, Bo rode into Esperanza, with Amara beside him on her own horsey, gentle mare he'd found in the back pasture, and spent a morning training to saddle. The town noticed immediately. Women who'd been chatting outside Peterson's general store fell silent. Men loitering near the cantina straightened and stared. Children playing in the dust stopped their games to watch the giant cowboy and the woman who rode beside him instead of behind him. At the general store, Bo held the door open for Amara, small gesture that sent ripples through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Inside, Peterson nervously measured out flour and coffee while stealing glances at his unusual customers. Other patrons found sudden interest in goods they'd probably never buy, their ears straining to catch every word of conversation. "What can I do for you folks?" Peterson asked, his voice pitched higher than usual. "Need supplies for the ranch," Bo said. "Also, the lady needs fabric, something suitable for new dresses." The word lady hit the store like a physical blow. Peterson's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Behind them, someone whispered something sharp and ugly that made Bo's shoulders tense. It was then that Clayton Morse chose to make his entrance. The rancher filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the store. He was dressed in his town clothes black suit, white shirt, silver watch chain butt. He wore them like armor, each piece carefully chosen to display his wealth and position. "Well, well," Morse said, his voice carrying the kind of smooth authority that brooked no argument. "If it isn't young Bo Laramie finally come to collect his inheritance." Bo turned slowly, his size making the movement seem deliberate and dangerous. "Mr. Morse, I was sorry to hear about Caleb," Morse continued, though his cold blue eyes suggested his sorrow was limited. "He was a practical man, understood how things work in this territory." "Did he?" "Oh yes, knew the importance of keeping certain arrangements, honoring certain agreements. I trust you'll be equally practical." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a badly banked fire. Around the store, conversations had stopped entirely. Even Peterson had ceased his measuring and weighing, frozen behind his counter like a man watching a lightning storm approach. Morse's gaze shifted to Amara, and Bo felt something dark and territorial stir in his chest. The rancher looked at her the way a man might appraise livestock, calculating value, considering uses, measuring possibilities. "I see you've brought Caleb's woman to town," Morse said. "Interesting choice. Most men would have settled such matters privately." "Her name is Amara," Bo said, his voice carrying a warning that even Morse couldn't miss. "Is it?" Morse smiled, the expression cold as winter wind. "How fascinating. Caleb never mentioned she had a name." The insult hit its mark perfectly. Amara's face remained composed, but Bo saw her hands clench slightly at her sides. In that moment, he understood that this was more than just a casual encounter. This was a test, carefully orchestrated and precisely timed. "Well," Morse continued, "I suppose we all have different ways of managing our property. Some men prefer a firmer hand than others." The word property was the spark that lit the fuse. Bo moved forward 2 steps, his size making the small store feel suddenly cramped. "She's not property." "No?" Morse raised an eyebrow. "Then what is she?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. What was Amara? Not his wife, not his employee, not his guest. The law said she belonged to him, but every instinct Bo possessed rejected that notion. The silence stretched between them while the entire store held its breath. "She's under my protection," Bo said finally. Morse la fida sound like breaking glass. Protection. How noble, how utterly impractical. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Bo could hear. "Your brother understood the realities of this territory. I hope you'll prove equally educable." With that, Morse touched the brim of his hat and walked out, leaving behind the kind of silence that follows thunder. The other customers began to disperse, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Peterson resumed his measuring with nervous efficiency, eager to complete the transaction and restore some normalcy to his store. Outside, as they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Amara spoke quietly. "That was dangerous." "Which part?" "All of it. Bringing me to town, calling me a lady, standing up to Morse." She secured a bag of flour with practiced efficiency. "He's not a man who accepts defiance gracefully." "Then he'll have to learn." Amara stopped her work and looked at him with those coffee-colored eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You don't understand what you're fighting. Morse doesn't just own land. He owns people, owns debts, owns secrets. He's been building his power for 20 years. And I'm just one man." "You're just one man," she agreed. "A good man, I think, but still just one." That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold, Bo made a decision that would define everything that followed. He disappeared into the house and returned with a simple wooden chair, nothing fancy, but solid and well-made. "This was my mother's chair," he said, setting it beside his own. "She used to sit here in the evenings, watching the sunset and planning tomorrow's work." Amara studied the chair as if it might contain hidden traps. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's yours now. Your chair, your place on this porch, your home if you want it. And if I don't want it?" Bo was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle high above the valley. "Then I'll help you get wherever you do want to go, but I hope you'll stay." "Why?" It was the question he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd seen her mending that shirt with such patient dignity. Why did he care what happened to this woman? Why had her simple hope that he wasn't his brother hit him harder than any fist ever had? "Because this place needs someone who knows how to make things grow in hard ground," he said finally. "Because I need to learn how to be better than the man who raised me. And because every time you look at me like I might actually be decent, I want to prove you right." Amara was quiet for so long that Bo began to think he'd said too much, revealed too much of the loneliness that had driven him from town to town, job to job, never quite finding a place where he fit. Then she reached out and touched the arm of her mother's chair with fingers that trembled just slightly. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." That night, Bo lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the desert coyotes calling across the valley, wind whispering through the sage, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. But underneath these familiar sounds was something new, the soft rhythm of another person's breathing, the sense of a presence in the house that brought comfort instead of threat. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Bo fell asleep without thinking about the past or worrying about the future. Instead, he dreamed of coffee-colored eyes and patient hands that could coax life from stubborn ground, and woke with the strange conviction that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning after Amara accepted her place on the porch, Bo woke to the smell of coffee and cornbread, drifting through the house like a promise of better days. He found her in the kitchen, moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to make do with whatever was available. The fire in the stove burned steady and clean, and the table was set for not master and servant, but two people sharing a meal. "Sleep well?" she asked, not looking up from the cast-iron pan where eggs sizzled in bacon grease. "Better than I have in years," Bo admitted, settling into one of the wooden chairs that had belonged to his parents. "You?" "The same." She slid eggs onto a plate beside the cornbread and set it in front of him. I'd forgotten what it felt like to sleep without listening for footsteps in the hall. The casual reference to her life under Caleb's rule hit Bo like a physical blow. He watched her pour coffee from the pot, noting the small scar on her wrist that disappeared beneath her sleeve, wondering what other marks his brother had left on her body and spirit. "Amara," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth, even if you think it might anger me." She set down the coffee pot and met his eyes directly. "Ask. Before, when you lived somewhere else, before my brother, what was your life like?" A shadow crossed her face, but she didn't look away. "I was born in Santa Fe. My father was a merchant. My mother came from a good Spanish family. They believed in education, even for daughters. I could read and write in 3 languages by the time I was 12. What happened? Drought came. Crops failed. My father borrowed money from men like Clayton Morse to keep his business alive." Her voice remained steady, matter of fact. "When he couldn't pay, they took everything. The house, the store, the horses, and when that wasn't enough, they took you. They took all of us. My parents died in the work camps. I was sold to a rancher near Albuquerque, then traded to another, then another. Your brother was the fourth man to own me. Bo's hands clenched around his coffee cup hard enough to make the ceramic creak. And before all this, what did you want to be? The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains that caught the morning light like purple silk. A teacher, she said finally. I wanted to open a school for children who couldn't afford education. Mexican children, Indian children, anyone who needed to learn to read and write and figure numbers. I thought knowledge was the one thing no one could take away. They were wrong, Bo said. Were they? Amara smiled, the expression transforming her face. I may not have my school, but I still carry everything I learned. Every book I read, every lesson I absorbed, it's all still here. She touched her temple gently. They took my freedom, but they never touched my mind. After breakfast, Bo led her out to the barn, where he'd been working to repair the damage Caleb's neglect had caused. The hayloft needed new boards, the stalls required mucking, and the entire structure could use a fresh coat of whitewash. But before he picked up his hammer, he pulled something from his pocket. It was a simple wooden comb, hand-carved from mesquite wood and polished smooth. Nothing fancy or expensive, but crafted with care and attention to detail. He'd worked on it by lamplight the previous evening, using the small knife he kept for repairs and whittling away at the wood until it felt right in his hands. I made this for you, he said, holding it out like an offering. Amara stared at the comb, as if it might disappear if she blinked. When she finally took it, her fingers traced the smooth wood with something approaching reverence. No one has given me anything in 3 years, she whispered, nothing that was mine to keep. Well, now you have something. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, not sadness, but something deeper and more complex. Why? It was the same question she'd asked about the chair, about staying, about everything he'd offered since arriving. And like before, Bo found himself searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself. Because you deserve to have beautiful things, he said finally. Because you deserve to be treated like someone who matters. That afternoon, he began teaching her about the ranch, not because he needed help, but because she'd asked. They walked the fence lines together, and he showed her how to spot weak posts and stretched wire. They checked the cattle, and he explained how to read the signs of health and sickness in the herd. They examined the water sources, and he taught her to recognize when a spring was running clean versus when it carried the alkaline taste that meant drought was coming. You're a natural at this, he told her as she successfully separated a lame steer from the herd, using only patience and positioning. I had a good teacher, she replied, but there was pride in her voice that hadn't been there that morning. It was while they were working that Maria Santos appeared, riding up the valley road on a sturdy burro loaded with baskets and bundles. She was a woman in her 50s, weathered by sun and hard work, but carrying herself with the dignity of someone who'd never bent to another's will. Her husband had died the previous winter, leaving her alone on a small plot of land south of town, and she made her living taking in washing and cooking for families who could afford the help. Buenos dias, she called out as she approached the house. I heard there was a new patron at the Laramie Ranch. I'm Bo, he said, walking over to help her down from the burro. And you are? Maria Santos. I worked for your brother sometimes, when he needed extra hands for cooking or cleaning. Her dark eyes moved to Amara with obvious curiosity. And this must be the woman the whole town is talking about. Amara straightened, preparing for judgment or cruelty, but Maria's face broke into a warm smile. They say you rode into town beside him like equals, Maria said. They say he called you a lady and meant it. True? True, Amara said carefully. Maria clapped her hands together like a delighted child. Que maravilloso. It's about time someone in this valley remembered that women have names and souls. From that afternoon forward, Maria became a regular presence at the ranch. She arrived 3 mornings a week to help with the heavy work-washing clothes, preparing meals for the long days, mending and sewing. But more than that, she became Amara's first friend in 3 years. Bo would find them talking in rapid Spanish while they worked, their conversation punctuated by laughter that rang across the valley like church bells. Maria brought news from town, gossip about who was courting whom, updates on which families were struggling with crops or cattle. But she also brought something more: precious acceptance. That woman has been through more than most would survive, Maria told Bo one evening as they watched Amara coax his stubborn mare to accept a new bridle. But she's strong, stronger than she knows. You treat her well, and she'll bloom like desert roses after rain. I'm trying, Bo said. I can see that. The question is whether the town will let you. It was a prescient observation. Word of Bo's unconventional treatment of Amara had spread through Esperanza like wildfire, and the reactions were becoming more pronounced with each passing day. Some people, mostly women who'd known hardship, themselves watched with cautious approval. But others, particularly the men who'd done business with Caleb, viewed Bo's behavior as dangerous weakness. The first real test came at the end of that week, when 3 of Clayton Morse's men rode up to the ranch just as the sun was setting. They weren't wearing guns openly, but their hands stayed close to their holsters, and their eyes held the kind of casual menace that came from men who'd used violence so often it had become second nature. "Evening, Laramie," said their leader, a thin man with a pockmarked face and dead eyes. "Name's Pike. I work for Mr. Morse." "What can I do for you?" Bo asked, moving slightly to put himself between the riders and where Amara stood on the porch. "Mr. Morse is concerned about certain rumors coming out of town, stories about how you're managing your inheritance." Pike's horse danced sideways, as nervous as its rider was calm. "He wanted us to make sure you understood the importance of maintaining certain standards." "What kind of standards?" "The kind that keep good order in the territory, the kind that make sure everyone knows their place." Pike's gaze shifted to Amara with obvious meaning. "Wouldn't want folks getting confused about how things work around here." Bo felt the familiar heat building in his chest, the same rage that had consumed him in the cellar when he'd found those chains. But this time he controlled it, channeled it into something more useful than simple fury. "I appreciate Mr. Morse's concern," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "but I think I can manage my own affairs." "Can you?" Pike smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "That's good to hear, real good, because it would be a shame if someone had to help you learn how things are done." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Behind him, Bo heard Amara's sharp intake of breath, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he stepped forward, using his considerable size to maximum advantage. "You know what I think?" Bo said conversationally. "I think if Mr. Morse has something to say to me, he can ride out here himself and say it. I think sending boys to deliver messages makes him look weak." Pike's face flushed red, but he was smart enough or experienced enough to recognize a losing proposition when he saw one. Bo Laramie's reputation had preceded him to the territory, and even 3-to-1 odds didn't look favorable when the one included a man who'd killed 2 gunfighters in Denver and walked away without a scratch. "We'll be sure to tell Mr. Morse you're grateful for his concern," Pike said finally, wheeling his horse around. "Real grateful." After they'd ridden away, Amara came down from the porch to stand beside him. "You've made an enemy," she said quietly. "I've made my choice," Bo replied. "Same choice I'd make again tomorrow." That night, as they sat in their chairs watching the stars emerge over the valley, Amara ran the wooden comb through her long hair with movements that spoke of deep contentment. The sight of her there relaxed, safe, beginning to trust filled Bo with a satisfaction he'd never experienced before. "Thank you," she said, not looking at him. "For what?" "For giving me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever." 3 weeks after Pike's visit, Bo found Amara sitting at the kitchen table with something he hadn't seen in years: a book. Not just any book, but a leather-bound journal with blank pages, its cover worn smooth by handling. She held a pencil with the reverent care of someone handling a sacred object. "Where did you get that?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Maria brought it from town, said she found it in Peterson's store and thought I might like it." Amara's fingers traced the journal's spine. "I haven't written anything in so long, I'm afraid I've forgotten how." "Like riding a horse," Bo said. "Once you learn, Your hands remember even when your mind thinks it's forgotten. She opened the journal to the first page and stared at the blank paper as if it contained infinite possibilities. What should I write about? Whatever's in your head, whatever you don't want to forget. That evening, by the light of the oil lamp, Amara began to write. Her hand moved slowly at first, forming letters with the careful precision of someone relearning a half-forgotten skill. But as the words began to flow, her movements became more confident, more natural. Bo watched from across the room where he was mending a bridle, fascinated by the transformation that came over her face as she wrote. The careful, guarded expression she usually wore relaxed into something approaching joy, and he realized he was witnessing the return of something essential that had been stolen from her. "What are you writing?" he asked during a pause, when she stopped to dip her pencil in water to clean the tip. "Everything," she said simply, "the way the mountains look at sunrise, the sound Maria makes when she laughs, the taste of coffee made with water from our spring." She looked up at him with eyes bright with possibility. "The way it feels to have someone give you a gift for no reason except kindness. Our spring, our ranch." The words hit him with unexpected force, carrying implications he wasn't sure either of them was ready to examine. But the ease with which she'd said them, the natural way the possessive had slipped into her vocabulary, made something warm and hopeful unfurl in his chest. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Father Miguel arrived just after breakfast, his ancient burro picking its way carefully up the rocky path to the house. The priest was a small man with kind eyes and work-hardened hands who'd been ministering to the scattered faithful of the territory for more than 20 years. "Buenos dias, mis amigos," he called out, raising a hand in greeting. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Never," Bo said, walking out to help the older man down from his mount. "What brings you out our way, Father?" "Curiosity, I'm afraid, and perhaps a touch of concern." Father Miguel accepted Bo's assistance with grateful dignity. "The talk in town has been most interesting lately." Amara appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When she saw the priest, something flickered across her face, not fear exactly, but wariness born of long experience with men who claimed to speak for God. "Señorita," Father Miguel said, removing his hat and offering a slight bow. "I am Father Miguel. I was hoping we might have a chance to speak." "About what?" "About many things. Your welfare, your soul, your place in this community." His voice carried genuine warmth. "But mostly about how we might help you feel welcome in God's house." Over coffee and Maria's excellent sweet bread, Father Miguel proved himself to be unlike any religious authority Amara had encountered. He spoke to her directly, looking her in the eyes, asking her opinions about scripture and philosophy. When she mentioned her education, he brightened like a man discovering unexpected treasure. "Latin?" he asked when she mentioned her languages. "You read Latin?" "Some. My tutor believed it was essential for understanding the roots of knowledge." "Magnifico. I have been hoping for years to find someone who could help me with some difficult passages in the ancient texts. My Latin is adequate for services, but for true scholarship." He spread his hands helplessly. Within an hour, they were deep in discussion about a particularly thorny theological question that had been troubling Father Miguel for months. Amara's eyes came alive in a way Bo had never seen before, her intelligence finally finding an outlet worthy of its scope. "You must come to town," Father Miguel said as he prepared to leave. "Not just for services, though you are always welcome. But I have books, Latin texts, Spanish poetry, even some works in French. I suspect you are a woman who hungers for knowledge the way others hunger for bread." After the priest departed, Amara stood in the doorway watching his burro disappear down the valley road. There was something different about her posture, something straighter and more confident. "He's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Judgment, condemnation, sermons about knowing my place and accepting my lot." She turned to him with a small smile. "Instead, he treated me like a scholar." "Because you are one." That afternoon, as they worked together repairing fence line damaged by a recent storm, Amara began to talk about her dreams, not just her old dream of teaching, but new possibilities she was beginning to imagine. "Father Miguel's books," she said, straightening a fence post while Bo hammered it secure. "He said some are in languages I've never studied. Italian, maybe some German. I could learn them. You could do anything you set your mind to." "Could I?" She paused in her work, a faraway look in her eyes. "Sometimes I wonder what I might have become if—" She stopped, shaking her head. "If what?" "If the world had been different. If my parents hadn't lost everything. If I'd been born a man, or rich, or in a place where women could own property and businesses." She resumed working, but with more force than necessary. Foolish thoughts. Not foolish, just delayed. That evening, as had become their custom, they sat on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Amara had brought her journal and was writing by the fading light, occasionally pausing to ask Bo about spelling or to test a phrase aloud. It was then that Clayton Morse himself finally made his appearance. The rancher rode up the valley road like a man going to war, flanked by 4 armed men who kept their hands near their weapons. He was dressed in his finest black coat, silver-trimmed saddle, polished boots as if he were attending a funeral rather than making a social call. "Laramie," he called out when he was still 20 yards from the house. "I think it's time you and I had a proper conversation." Bo rose slowly from his chair, his size making the movement seem deliberate and dangerous. "Mr. Morse, what can I do for you?" "You can start by showing proper respect for your betters," Morse said, dismounting with practiced grace. "And you can stop this embarrassing display that's making the whole territory look weak." "What display is that?" Morse gestured toward Amara with obvious contempt. "This charade of treating property like people, this dangerous precedent you're setting with your bleeding heart nonsense." Bo felt the familiar heat building in his chest, but beside him, Amara's quiet presence served as an anchor. He could feel her watching, waiting to see what kind of man he really was when the pressure mounted. "She has a name," Bo said quietly. "I don't give a damn what you call it," Morse snapped. "What I care about is the example you're setting. Do you have any idea how many ranchers in this territory depend on bonded labor? How many arrangements you're threatening with your foolish sentimentality? Arrangements like the ones you had with my brother." Morse's eyes narrowed. "Your brother understood reality, understood that some people are born to serve and others to command. He knew his place in the natural order." "The natural order." Bo stepped down from the porch, his boots making solid sounds on the wooden steps. "And where exactly do you fit in this natural order?" "At the top, boy, where my money and influence have put me." Morse's hand drifted toward his gun, a gesture his men immediately mirrored. "The question is where you fit. With the civilized men who understand how the world works, or with the bleeding hearts who get people killed with their idealism." The threat was clear, but Bo had faced down dangerous men before. What surprised him was Amara's voice, calm and clear in the tense silence. "Mr. Morse," she said, rising from her chair with liquid grace, "you speak of natural order, but I wonder if you've considered that perhaps the truly natural order is one where people are judged by their character rather than their circumstances." Morse spun toward her, his face flushing red with outrage. "How dare you speak to me, you—" "Careful," Bo interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that even Morse couldn't ignore. "Think very carefully about your next words." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Then Morse seemed to remember where he was and who he was facing. Bo Laramie might be idealistic, but he was also 6.5 feet of muscle and bone, with a reputation for settling disputes permanently. "This isn't over," Morse said finally, mounting his horse with sharp, angry movements. "This territory has ways of dealing with people who threaten the established order, ways that don't require direct confrontation." After they'd ridden away, Bo and Amara stood in the gathering dusk, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. "That was brave," Bo said, "speaking up like that. Was it brave, or just foolish?" Amara sank back into her chair, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly frightened. "He's going to make us pay for that humiliation." "Let him try." You don't understand. Men like Morse don't fight fair. They don't come at you straight on where you can see them coming." She clutched her journal against her chest like a shield. "They attack the things you love, the people you care about. They find ways to hurt you that don't leave marks their enemies can see." That night, Bo found sleep elusive. He lay in bed listening to the desert sounds wind through sage, distant coyote calls, the soft lowing of cattle, but underneath the familiar symphony was something new. The sound of Amara moving restlessly in her room down the hall. Near midnight, he heard her get up and move through the house. When he looked out his window, he could see her sitting on the porch in her nightgown and robe, writing in her journal by moonlight. There was something desperate about her posture, as if she were trying to capture and preserve something before it could be taken away. Without really thinking about it, Bo pulled on his pants and boots and walked out to join her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into his chair. "Too much thinking." She didn't look up from her writing. "Too many possibilities running through my head. Good possibilities or bad ones?" "Both." She paused in her writing and looked at him in the silver light. "I keep thinking about what Father Miguel said, about his books and his library, about the chance to learn new things, to teach others what I know. And I keep thinking about what Morse said, about the ways he has of dealing with threats." She closed the journal carefully and set it in her lap. "I'm afraid that by caring about me, you've put yourself in danger you didn't bargain for." Bo was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. "Amara, I want you to listen to me, and I want you to believe what I'm telling you. I've spent my whole life running from fights, running from complications, running from anything that might require me to stand for something bigger than myself." He leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "But sitting here with you, watching you discover pieces of yourself you thought were lost forever, it's the first time I've ever felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Bo, I'm not finished. Whatever danger comes from caring about you, whatever price Morse thinks he can make me pay, it's worth it. You're worth it. Not because you belong to me, but because you don't belong to anyone. Because you're free to choose, and if you choose to stay here, to build something with me, then we'll face whatever comes together." In the moonlight, he could see tears glistening on her cheeks, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I choose to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is the first place that's ever felt like home." And in that moment, sitting on the porch under a canopy of desert stars, something fundamental shifted between them. They were no longer master and former slave, no longer protector and protected. They were simply two people who had found in each other the possibility of becoming more than they had ever been alone. The morning after their midnight conversation, Bo woke to find Amara already in the kitchen, but something was different. She moved with a new confidence, her shoulders straighter, her smile coming easier. When she handed him his coffee, their fingers brushed, and neither of them pulled away. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she told him as they sat down to breakfast, "about building something together. Have you? I want to contribute more than just keeping house and helping with ranch work. I want to be a true partner in whatever we're building here." She met his eyes directly. "I want to start teaching." The idea hit Bo like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so perfectly right that he wondered why he hadn't thought of it himself. Teaching who? Anyone who needs to learn. The Mexican children from the farms south of here, the Apache children from the reservation, the white children whose families can't afford to send them away to school. Her voice gained strength as she spoke. "There are dozens of children in this valley who will grow up unable to read or write unless someone helps them. And you want to be that someone. I want to try." That afternoon, Bo rode into town alone, leaving Amara at the ranch with strict instructions to stay armed and alert. His destination was Father Miguel's modest church, where he hoped to find answers to questions he'd been avoiding since arriving in the territory. The priest was in the small cemetery behind the church, tending to the graves with the patient care of a man who understood that memory required maintenance. He looked up as Bo approached, his weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "Bo, my son, what brings you to town without your beautiful companion?" "I need to ask you about my family, father. About things my brother might have done, agreements he might have made." Bo removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Things I need to understand if I'm going to protect what matters to me." Father Miguel set down his tools and gestured toward a simple wooden bench beneath an ancient cottonwood. "Sit. Tell me what troubles you." For the next hour, Bo found himself telling the priest everything about finding the chains in the cellar, about Morse's threats, about his growing feelings for Amara, and his fear that his ignorance of his brother's business might put her in danger. "Your brother was not an evil man," Father Miguel said finally, "but he was a weak one. Weak men often do evil things because they lack the strength to resist evil influences." "What kind of influences?" The priest was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mountains that rose like cathedral spires beyond the valley. "There are things in this territory that good men pretend not to see. The buying and selling of human souls, the theft of land from families too poor to fight back, the silencing of voices that speak against injustice. And Caleb was part of it? Your brother was a tool, nothing more. Clayton Morse and men like him needed someone to do the work their reputations couldn't afford to be associated with." Father Miguel's voice carried a sadness that spoke of confession booth secrets. "Caleb took land from families who defaulted on loans. He delivered people to those who bought them. He collected debts in ways that left no legal evidence." Bo felt sick. "How many people did he hurt?" "Too many. But his sins are not your sins, my son. You have the chance to build something different, something that honors God rather than serving mammon. Amara wants to start a school. Que maravilloso. This valley has needed a teacher for years." Father Miguel's face brightened. "I could help, you know. I have books, supplies, space in the church for classes during the week." "You do that? For her? For the children she would teach? Por supuesto." The priest stood and clasped Bo's shoulder. "But you must understand, this will make Morse even angrier. Educated people are harder to control, harder to cheat, harder to frighten into submission." That evening, Bo returned to the ranch with more than just information. In his saddlebags were 3 precious books Father Miguel had insisted he take: a primer for beginning readers, a mathematics text, and a worn copy of Cervantes that the priest claimed would help Amara maintain her Spanish literature while teaching others. He found her in the garden, harvesting vegetables for dinner, her journal open on a nearby stump where she'd been writing between tasks. The sight of her there, productive, peaceful, utterly belonging to the place, made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to name. "I have something for you," he said, dismounting and retrieving the books from his saddlebags. Amara's face transformed when she saw them. She set down her basket and approached the books as if they were made of spun gold, her fingers hovering over the leather covers before finally touching them with reverent care. "Where did you?" "Father Miguel. He wants to help with the school, says you can use the church for classes, and he has more books where these came from." She opened the Cervantes and read a few lines in Spanish, her voice soft and musical. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding what this means to me. Thank you for trusting me with your dreams." That night, they sat on the porch reading by lamplight, Amara absorbed in Cervantes, Bo working his way through a book on cattle breeding he'd bought in town. It was a picture of domestic contentment that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. But their peace was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, and Bo's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against his chair. Then the rider called out, and he recognized Maria Santos's voice. "Bo, Amara, vengan rápido." She rode up to the house at a pace that spoke of urgent news, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled by hard riding. "What's wrong?" Bo asked, helping her down from her horse. "Trouble in town. Bad trouble." Maria's breathing was labored from exertion. "Morse has been meeting with other ranchers, talking about the example you're setting." They say you're encouraging dangerous ideas among the workers. What kind of dangerous ideas? That bonded people have rights, that contracts can be broken, that women can own property and businesses. Maria's dark eyes moved to Amara with obvious concern. They're planning something, I don't know what. But Ramon, who works at the cantina, heard them talking about making examples, about showing the territory what happens to people who upset the natural order. Amara closed her book carefully, her face pale in the lamplight. How long do we have? I don't know. Maybe days, maybe weeks. But you need to be careful, both of you. After Maria left, promising to keep her ears open for more information, Bo and Amara sat in silence on the porch. The books that had seemed like such treasures an hour before now felt like evidence of their dangerous presumption. Are you having second thoughts? Bo asked finally. About the school? About staying here? About us? Amara shook her head. No, but I am thinking about what Father Miguel said, about weak men doing evil things because they can't resist evil influences. What about it? I'm thinking that maybe the time for trying to avoid conflict is over. Maybe the time has come to choose a side and fight for it. Bo looked at her in the moonlight, this woman who'd survived 3 years of bondage and emerged with her spirit intact, who dreamed of teaching children and spoke of fighting for justice with equal passion. In that moment, he realized that somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, he'd fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. Then we fight, he said simply, even if it costs us everything, especially then. Later that night, as Bo lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he found himself thinking about the worn Bible that had belonged to his father. It still sat on the shelf in the main room, filled with harsh underlinings and margin notes that reflected a faith built on judgment rather than mercy. His father had believed that God demanded obedience, that strength meant never showing weakness, that a man's worth was measured by his ability to control others. But watching Amara read Cervantes by lamplight, seeing her eyes light up at the prospect of teaching children to read, listening to her speak of justice and dignity for all people, Bo was beginning to understand that maybe his father's God had been too small, too frightened, too concerned with maintaining power to recognize real strength when it appeared. Real strength, he was learning, looked like a woman who refused to let cruelty break her spirit. Real strength looked like choosing to protect rather than control, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than fear. And if that made him weak in Clayton Morse's eyes, so be it. Some kinds of weakness were worth more than all the strength the world had to offer. The first kiss happened 3 days later, as naturally as sunrise after a long night. Amara had been working in the garden when a sudden thunderstorm rolled over the mountains, bringing with it the kind of desert downpour that could flood arroyos in minutes. She ran for the house, laughing as the rain soaked through her dress, and Bo met her on the porch with a towel and a smile that made her breath catch. "Wet as a drowned cat," he said, wrapping the towel around her shoulders. "But happy," she replied, looking up at him with rain droplets clinging to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. And then, without planning or thought or any of the careful consideration they'd been giving to every other aspect of their relationship, Bo cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle and reverent and full of all the words they hadn't yet found courage to speak aloud. When they finally broke apart, Amara's eyes were wide with wonder. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh," Bo agreed. They stood there in the aftermath of rain and revelation, while thunder rolled across the valley like applause from the heavens themselves. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, everything felt different. Not awkward or complicated, but deeper somehow, as if they'd finally acknowledged what had been growing between them since that first morning when she'd looked up from her mending with eyes that held no fear. "I need to tell you something," Amara said as they sat down to eat. "Something I've been afraid to say because once the words are spoken, they can't be taken back." Bo set down his fork and gave her his complete attention. "Say it." "I love you." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back so long they burst forth of their own accord. "Not because you saved me, not because you gave me freedom, not because you're the first man to treat me with kindness. I love you because of who you are when you think no one is watching, because of the way you listen when I talk about my dreams, because you make me feel like the person I was always meant to be." Bo felt something expand in his chest, something warm and bright and infinitely precious. "I love you too. Have been falling in love with you since the moment you told me you hoped I wasn't my brother." "What does that mean for us?" "It means we stop pretending this is temporary. It means we start planning a future instead of just surviving the present." He reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly her fingers fit between his. "It means I want to marry you if you'll have me." Amara's smile was radiant. Yes, but their happiness was short-lived. The next morning brought Sheriff Bradley riding hard up the valley road, his face grim with purpose. He dismounted heavily, the star on his vest catching the morning light like a warning. "Bo, miss." He touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. "I'm afraid I've got some unpleasant business to discuss." "What kind of business?" "The kind that comes from men with too much influence and too little patience." Bradley's weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and conscience. "Clayton Morse has filed formal complaints against you with the territorial governor. Says you're harboring stolen property, encouraging sedition among the bonded workers, threatening the economic stability of the region." Bo felt his jaw clench. "Stolen property?" "He's claiming that Miss Amara here was never legally transferred to your brother, that she rightfully belongs to a rancher over in Texas who's been looking for her." Bradley's voice carried the tone of a man delivering news he didn't believe. "Says he has documentation to prove it." "That's impossible," Amara said, but her voice carried a tremor of fear. "I've been here for 3 years. If someone was looking for me, they'd have found you by now." Bo finished. "This is fabrication, Sheriff. You know it, and I know it. What I know and what I can prove in a territorial court are two different things." Bradley's voice was heavy with frustration. "Morse is also claiming that you've been encouraging other ranchers' workers to break their contracts, that you're planning to set up some kind of school that would teach dangerous ideas about equality and property rights. Dangerous ideas like reading and arithmetic. Ideas like thinking they deserve better than they got," Bradley said quietly. "Look, Bo, I don't like this any more than you do. But Morse has friends in Santa Fe, friends with real power. If this goes to territorial court, it won't matter what's right or wrong. It'll matter who has the most influence." After the sheriff left, Bo and Amara sat on the porch in stunned silence. The future they'd been planning that morning, marriage, children, a school for valley children, suddenly seemed as fragile as morning dew. "He's going to take me away," Amara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like hell he is. You don't understand. I've seen this before, this kind of legal maneuvering. Rich men don't fight fair, and they don't fight alone. They have lawyers and judges and politicians who owe them favors." She clutched the silver locket at her throat, the only thing she'd brought with her when she came to the ranch. "They can make papers say anything they want. Then we don't fight in their courts." "What do you mean?" Bo stood and began pacing the length of the porch, his mind working through possibilities and consequences. "I mean, we make it impossible for them to take you anywhere. I mean, we get married today, right now, before they can serve any papers or drag you away to face trumped-up charges. Bo, think about it. If you're my wife, legally married under territorial law, it becomes much harder for them to claim you belong to someone else. A married woman has some legal protections, even here." Amara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains where clouds were building for another afternoon storm. "And if it doesn't work, if they decide that the law doesn't apply to people like me, then at least we'll have had the chance to be husband and wife, even if it's only for a short time. That's not much of a future to offer someone. It's the only future I want." 2 hours later, they stood in Father Miguel's small church, speaking vows that carried the weight of defiance as much as devotion. Maria Santos and her nephew served as witnesses, while the old priest spoke the ancient words that bound 2 lives together in the eyes of God and man. "Do you, Beaumont Laramie, Take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part. I do. Do you, Amara Santos? Amara Delgado, she corrected gently. My real name is Amara Delgado. Father Miguel smiled and began again. Do you, Amara Delgado, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The kiss that sealed their marriage was different from their first, deeper, more certain, flavored with the knowledge that they'd chosen each other completely and irrevocably. When they broke apart, both were crying. Are you ready for whatever comes next? Bo asked, holding her hands in his. With you, I'm ready for anything. But as they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, both newly wed and newly frightened, neither could shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. In the distance, dark clouds massed over the valley like an army preparing for war. That night, they lay together as husband and wife for the first time, holding each other with the desperate tenderness of people who understood that happiness was a fragile thing in a world that often rewarded cruelty over kindness. Amara's head rested on Bo's chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin while he stroked her long hair. Tell me about your family, he said quietly. Your real family, before everything changed. Amara was quiet for so long, he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she began to speak, her voice soft in the darkness. My father was the kindest man I ever knew. He used to say that a person's worth wasn't measured by their wealth or their bloodline, but by how they treated those who had less than they did. She shifted slightly, pressing closer to Bo's warmth. My mother taught me that education was the one gift no one could steal from you, no matter how poor you became or how far you fell. They sound like good people. They were. They would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated the way you've chosen to use your strength. She lifted her head to look at him in the moonlight, streaming through the window. They would have been proud to call you son, and they would have been amazed by the woman their daughter became. Would they? There was uncertainty in her voice, the echo of 3 years' worth of doubt and diminishment. Sometimes I wonder if they would recognize me now, if I'm still the person they raised, or if I've become something else entirely. You're exactly who they raised you to be, Bo said with conviction. You survived what would have broken most people, and you came through it with your heart intact. You still dream of teaching children, still believe in justice, still have room in your life for love. If that's not who your parents raised, then I don't know what is. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the valley floor. But inside their small bedroom, wrapped in each other's arms, Bo and Amara felt safe and complete in a way that neither had ever experienced before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of their commitment to each other and to the life they were trying to build. But tonight, they were simply husband and wife, two people who had found in each other the courage to hope for something better than the world had offered them so far. Whatever happens, Amara whispered as sleep began to claim them both, I want you to know that these have been the happiest months of my life. Mine too, Bo replied, pulling her closer, and we're just getting started. The discovery came by accident, as the most important discoveries often do. Bo had been in the cellar again, this time searching for mason jars that Amara needed for preserving the vegetables from her garden. He'd already torn down the instruments of torture his brother had kept there, but the space still felt tainted, heavy with the weight of cruelties committed in darkness. It was while moving an old wooden crate that he felt it give way beneath his hands. The bottom board was loose, warped by years of desert humidity, and when it shifted, papers scattered across the earthen floor like autumn leaves. At first glance, they appeared to be the usual detritus of his brother's business receipts, bills of sale, correspondence with other ranchers. But as Bo gathered them up, one document caught his attention. The paper was older than the others, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was different, more educated, more careful. It was a deed, a legal document transferring ownership of 800 acres in the Esperanza Valley from Eduardo Delgado to Clayton Morse, dated 7 years earlier. The land, described in careful legal language, encompassed the southern portion of what was now Morse's ranch, the richest grazing land in the territory. But it was the signature at the bottom that made Bo's blood run cold. Eduardo Delgado had signed with a shaking hand, and beside his name in different ink, someone had added a note. Under duress, family held as surety. Bo's hands trembled as he examined the other papers scattered around the broken crate. More deeds, more transfers, more signatures, accompanied by threats thinly veiled as legal language. And in the middle of it all, a letter in his brother Caleb's unmistakable scrawl. Morse, the Delgado family has been dealt with as requested. The father died resisting arrest. The mother succumbed to fever in the work camp. The daughter is healthy and has been transferred to your associate in Albuquerque for eventual placement. As agreed, this concludes our business regarding the Delgado holdings. See Laramie. The world seemed to tilt beneath Bo's feet. He sank to his knees in the dirt, the papers scattered around him like evidence of sins that could never be forgiven. Amara Delgado. Not Santos, not some unknown surname she'd invented for protection, but Delgado. The daughter of Eduardo Delgado, whose land now formed the heart of Clayton Morse's empire. She wasn't just a victim of the territory's brutal labor system. She was the rightful heir to some of the richest land in the valley, stolen through fraud and murder, and covered up through a conspiracy that reached from Santa Fe to the remotest ranch in the territory. Bo. Amara's voice came from above, floating down through the cellar, opening like a lifeline. Are you all right down there? Fine, he called back, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Just looking for those jars. But he wasn't fine. His hands shook as he gathered the papers, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd discovered. His brother hadn't just been Clayton Morse's enforcer, he'd been his partner in theft and murder. And the woman Bo had fallen in love with, the woman he'd married just days before, was the living proof of crimes that could bring down the most powerful man in the territory. When he finally climbed out of the cellar, Amara took one look at his face and set down the dish she'd been washing. What's wrong? She asked, her coffee-colored eyes immediately alert to danger. We need to talk. They sat at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many moments of growing intimacy. But now, the familiar space felt charged with electricity, as if the very air between them carried the weight of revelation. I found something in the cellar, Bo said, setting the papers on the table between them. Something about your family. Amara's face went very still. What kind of something? Legal documents, deeds transferring land from Eduardo Delgado to Clayton Morse. He watched her face carefully. Amara, was Eduardo Delgado your father? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Amara finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. How did you know? These papers, they tell the whole story, how Morse cheated your family out of their land, how my brother helped him do it, how he couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't bring himself to say the words that would make it real. How they killed my parents. Amara's voice was steady, but tears ran down her cheeks like silver rivers. Yes, I know. I've always known. You knew? All this time, you knew that Morse was responsible for your family's death, and you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? The words came out sharp, edged with 3 years' worth of suppressed rage. Who was I supposed to tell? The sheriff who takes Morse's money? The judge who owes him favors? The territorial governor who counts him as a friend? Bo stared at her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not just the patient woman who'd survived his brother's cruelties, not just the loving wife who'd given him hope for a different kind of life, but a woman who'd been living with the knowledge of her parents' murder, who'd been planning something he'd been too blind to see. You came here deliberately, he said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. You didn't just happen to be among my brother's property. You chose to be here. I chose survival over revenge. For 3 years, I chose to endure whatever your brother did to me because I knew that someday, somehow, I would find a way to make Morse pay for what he took from my family. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, but her eyes remained hard as flint. I just never expected to fall in love with you. And now I have a choice to make. Continue hiding, continue pretending to be just another piece of human property, or claim what's rightfully mine and fight for justice. Bo looked down at the papers spread across the table, evidence of conspiracy, theft, and murder that went to the very heart of the territory's power structure. In the right hands, these documents could bring down Clayton Morse and everyone who'd helped him build his empire on other people's bones. There's more, he said quietly. According to these deeds, you're not just a victim of Morse's crimes. You're the legal heir to 800 acres of the best grazing land in the territory, land that's now worth a fortune. Amara's laugh was bitter. Legal heir to stolen land, you mean? Do you think any court in this territory would honor my claim against Clayton Morse's word? Maybe not any court, but the right court with the right evidence might surprise you. And what court would that be? Federal court. These crimes crossed territorial boundaries, involved mail fraud, probably violated federal statutes about slavery and involuntary servitude. Bo's mind was working furiously, connecting dots that had been invisible just hours before. With the right lawyer, the right presentation of evidence, the right lawyer would end up dead in an arroyo before he could file the first motion. Amara stood and began pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. You're thinking like a man who believes in justice, Bo. But justice is a luxury for people who can afford it. So what do you suggest? We burn the papers and pretend we never found them. I suggest we do what we've been doing, survive. Build our life together, raise our children if God blesses us with them, and try to find happiness in spite of the evil that men do. And let Morse get away with murdering your parents. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a grass fire. Amara stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes blazing with an emotion he'd never seen before. My parents are dead, Bo. Nothing I do will bring them back. But I'm alive, and so are you. And we have a chance at happiness that I never thought I'd see again. She gestured toward the papers with obvious distaste. Those documents are dangerous, not just to Morse, but to us. The moment we try to use them, we become threats that have to be eliminated. So we do nothing? We do what we can do safely. We build our school. We teach children to read and write. We try to make the world a little better for the people who come after us. She sat back down and reached across the table to take his hands. Isn't that enough? Bo looked at her, his wife, his love, the strongest person he'd ever known, and felt his heart breaking, because he could see in her eyes that she didn't really believe her own words, could see that the desire for justice burned in her as bright as his anger, but that 3 years of powerlessness had taught her to choose survival over satisfaction. What if there was a way to get justice without getting ourselves killed? He asked quietly. There isn't. But what if there was? Amara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Then I would say that Eduardo Delgado's daughter has been waiting 7 years to reclaim what was stolen from her family. That night, they lay in bed holding each other, while the wind howled across the valley like the voices of the unavenged dead. The papers were hidden now, secured in a place where they would be safe from discovery but available when the time came to use them. Are you sorry? Amara asked in the darkness. Sorry you married a woman with such dangerous secrets? I'm sorry your family was murdered. Bo replied, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry my brother was part of it. I'm sorry you've had to carry this burden alone for so long. But are you sorry you married me? Bo turned in the darkness and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion he possessed. Never, not for a single moment. Even if it costs us everything, especially then. Outside, the wind continued to blow, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain and the promise of storms to come. But inside their small bedroom, husband and wife held each other close and planned for a future that would either bring justice or destroy them both. The game had changed completely. They were no longer just fighting for their right to love each other. They were fighting for truth, for justice, for the memory of two good people who'd been murdered, for the crime of standing in a powerful man's way. And tomorrow, they would begin the dangerous work of deciding how to use the weapons fate had placed in their hands. The morning after the revelation brought unexpected visitors to the ranch. Father Miguel arrived first, his ancient burro loaded with books and supplies for the school that Amara still hoped to start. But his usual cheerful demeanor was clouded with worry. "Mis amigos," he said, dismounting with obvious reluctance, "I bring troubling news from town." "What kind of news?" Bo asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Clayton Morse has been asking questions. Very specific questions about old church records, baptisms and marriages from 7 years ago." The priest's weathered hands shook slightly as he unloaded his burros. "He's also been inquiring about any documents that might have been stored in the church archives, particularly anything related to the Delgado family." Amara's face went pale. "He knows. Perhaps. Or perhaps he merely suspects." Father Miguel's eyes were grave. "But either way, he is moving to protect himself. 3 families have been forced off their land this week, alone families who owed him money, families who might have been sympathetic to your cause." "Our cause?" Bo asked. "The cause of justice, my son. Word spreads quickly in a small territory. People know that Eduardo Delgado was a good man, that his family was cheated and murdered. They also know that his daughter survived." The priest looked directly at Amara. "They are watching to see if the powerful can be made to answer for their crimes." Later that morning, Maria Santos arrived with more disturbing news. She'd overheard conversations at the cantina, whispered discussions among Morse's men about plans being made, preparations being put in place. "They're gathering men," she told them as they sat around the kitchen table. "Not just Morse's regular hands, but hired guns from outside the territory. Men with no ties to this place, no reason to hesitate about doing whatever they're paid to do." "How many?" Bo asked. "Too many. And there's something else." Maria's dark eyes were filled with worry. "They've sent word to Santa Fe, to the territorial capital. Official word through official channels. They're claiming that you're harboring stolen property and inciting rebellion among the bonded workers. Meaning that within days, maybe hours, you'll have federal marshals riding up that valley road with papers giving them authority to take Amara back to her rightful owner in Texas." The weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were facing not just Clayton Morse and his hired guns, but the full power of territorial law backed by federal authority. Against such forces, what chance did one man and one woman have, no matter how righteous their cause? It was then that Amara made the decision that would change everything. "I want to see them," she said quietly. "See what?" Bo asked. "The documents. All of them. Every paper that proves what Morse did to my family." Her voice carried a new determination. "And I want to understand exactly what they mean in legal terms." For the next hour, they spread the hidden papers across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that told a story of systematic theft and murder. Father Miguel, who had some education in legal matters from his seminary training, helped them understand the implications of what they were seeing. "This deed here," he said, pointing to the document transferring Eduardo Delgado's land to Morse. "It specifically mentions that the transfer was made under duress with family held as surety. In legal terms, that makes it invalid. A contract signed under threat is no contract at all." "But who would enforce that?" Amara asked. "The right judge, with the right evidence, might surprise you." Father Miguel's voice carried a note of hope. "I know federal judges who believe in the rule of law, regardless of a man's wealth or influence." "And how do we get the evidence to such a judge without being killed first?" Bo asked. It was Maria who provided the answer. "My nephew Carlos works for the Territorial Mail Service. He rides the route between here and Santa Fe twice a week. If you could get copies of these documents to the right people." Copies wouldn't be sufficient, Father Miguel interrupted. Any federal judge would require the original documents to consider them as evidence. Then we send the originals, Amara said simply. Amara, no. Bo's voice was sharp with concern. Those papers are the only proof we have. If they're lost or intercepted, then we're no worse off than we are now. She stood and began pacing the small kitchen, her mind clearly working through possibilities and consequences. But if they reach the right judge, if they're presented properly with the right legal arguments, they could bring down not just Morse, but everyone who helped him, Father Miguel finished. The conspiracy reaches into the territorial government, into business circles in Santa Fe, even into federal offices. The right investigation could expose corruption that goes far beyond one family's murder. That afternoon, while Amara and Father Miguel worked on preparing a legal brief to accompany the documents, Bo found himself thinking about his mother's wedding ring. It had been sitting in a small wooden box on his dresser since he'd arrived at the ranch, waiting for the right moment, the right woman, the right reason to pass it on. The ring itself was simply a thin band of gold, with a small diamond that caught the light like a captured star. His father had bought it with money saved from 2 years of working cattle drives, and his mother had worn it every day of their married life. When she died, his father had given it to Caleb, expecting him to marry and continue the family line. But Caleb had never found a woman he wanted to marry, and the ring had remained in its box, gathering dust and waiting for love to give it purpose again. Now, as Bo held the ring up to the window and watched the diamonds scatter rainbows across the wall, he thought about the woman who had worn it before and the woman who would wear it now. His mother had been a gentle soul, a woman who believed in the power of kindness to overcome cruelty. She would have loved Amara, would have seen in her the same strength and grace that had first attracted Bo. "For you," he said that evening, offering the ring to his wife as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Amara took the ring with trembling hands, examining the simple band and modest stone as if they were made of the most precious materials on earth. "It was my mother's," Bo explained. "She wore it for 23 years, through good times and bad, through poverty and modest prosperity, through the birth of 2 sons and the building of a life in hard country." "It's beautiful," Amara whispered. "She would have wanted you to have it, would have wanted you to carry on the tradition of wearing it with love and dignity." As Amara slipped the ring onto her finger, something seemed to settle into place, not just the ring, but their resolve, their commitment to each other and to the fight they were about to undertake. "Tomorrow," she said, "we send the documents to Santa Fe." "Tomorrow," Bo agreed. That night, they made love, with the desperate passion of people who understood that their time together might be measured in days rather than years. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, they spoke quietly of the future they hoped to build and the children they might raise if they survived what was coming. "What will you name our first daughter?" Amara asked, her head resting on Bo's chest. "Hope," he said without hesitation, "because she'll be born into a world where 2 people who loved each other refused to let evil have the final word." "And our first son?" "Eduardo, after your father, so his name and his memory will live on." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Carlos Santos arrived just after breakfast, ready to carry their precious cargo to Santa Fe, and the federal judge who might, if they were very lucky, care more about justice than politics. "Guard these with your life," Father Miguel told the young man as he secured the documents in a specially prepared package. "What you carry could change the course of this territory's future." "I understand, Padre," Carlos replied, his young face serious with the weight of responsibility. "They'll reach Judge Morrison's office safely, I promise." As they watched Carlos ride away down the valley road, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that caught the morning light, Bo and Amara stood together on the porch of their ranch house and prepared for war. "How long?" she asked. 2 days for Carlos to reach Santa Fe, maybe a day for the judge to review the documents and decide what to do about them. 2 days for word to travel back. Bo's arm tightened around her waist. By the end of the week, We'll know if we're going to face this fight with the law on our side or against us. And if the law doesn't help us, then we fight anyway, because some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't win. That afternoon, they began their preparations in earnest. Bo cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranchie's rifle, his pistol, an old shotgun that had belonged to his father, even the rusty Colt he'd found in his brother's effects. Amara, meanwhile, prepared what she called their emergency supplies, food that wouldn't spoil, water containers that could be easily carried, basic medical supplies for treating wounds. "You're planning for a siege," Father Miguel observed as he watched their preparations. "Or a flight," Bo replied, "depending on how things develop. And if neither siege nor flight is possible." Bo looked at the priest, this good man who'd risked his own safety to help them, and spoke the truth that had been growing in his heart since the moment he'd found those documents. "Then we make our stand here, on this land, for this principle. We make sure that when people tell the story of what happened in Esperanza Valley, they remember that two people who loved each other chose to fight for justice rather than live with injustice, even if it costs you everything. Especially then." As the sun set on what might be their last peaceful evening, Bo and Amara sat in their chairs on the porch, holding hands and watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate across the vast emptiness of the desert. "No regrets?" Bo asked. "Only one," Amara replied. "What's that?" "That we didn't have more time, that we didn't get to grow old together, to see our children married, to sit on this porch as grandparents and tell stories about the days when we were young and brave and foolish enough to think we could change the world. Maybe we still will. Maybe. But even if we don't, even if tomorrow brings the end of everything we've built together, I want you to know that these have been the best months of my life. You gave me back my name, my dignity, my hope for the future. You loved me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. And you taught me what it means to be a good man instead of just a strong one." In the distance, barely visible in the starlight, a dust cloud was moving up the valley road. Too far away to identify, too small to be immediately threatening, but there nonetheless a reminder that their enemies were circling, that the time for peace was nearly over. But for now, in this moment, they were simply husband and wife, sitting together on their porch, wearing his mother's wedding ring and planning for a future that might never come. Dawn came too soon and too quiet. Bo woke to a silence that felt wrong, the kind of unnatural stillness that preceded violent storms. Even the usual desert sounds coyote calls whined through sage. The distant lowing of cattle seemed muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Beside him, Amara stirred and opened her eyes, instantly alert in the way of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary. "They're coming," she said. Though she hadn't looked out the window or heard any approaching hoofbeats, she simply knew, the way prey animals know when predators are stalking them. Bo rose and moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains at the valley road that stretched like a pale scar across the desert floor. At first he saw nothing but morning shadows and heat shimmer beginning to rise from the sun-baked earth. Then the light shifted, and he saw them. Riders. More than a dozen, maybe 20, spread out in a loose formation that spoke of military training or long experience with violence. At their head rode Clayton Morse himself, his black stallion prancing with nervous energy, his silver hair catching the early light like a crown. "How many?" Amara asked, pulling on her dress with practiced efficiency. "Too many." Bo reached for his rifle, his brother's weapon, the instrument that had been used to commit crimes he was now trying to redress. The irony wasn't lost on him. "But not so many that we can't make them remember this day." They moved through the house with quiet purpose, checking weapons, securing ammunition, preparing for a siege they both knew they couldn't win. But winning, Bo realized, had never been the point. The point was to stand, to fight, to refuse to let evil triumph without cost. The documents? Amara asked, as they took positions at windows that offered good views of the approaching riders. Carlos should be in Santa Fe by now, if Judge Morrison is the man Father Miguel believes him to be. If, Amara said, but without bitterness. So many ifs in our story. The riders had stopped about 200 yards from the house, well within rifle range, but positioned so that any shots from the windows would have to travel uphill, a tactical disadvantage that spoke of Clayton Morse's military background. He sat his horse with the patience of a man who knew that time was on his side, that he could afford to wait while his enemies grew desperate. "Laramie," Morse's voice carried clearly across the desert air. "I've come to reclaim stolen property and arrest a fugitive from justice. Send out the woman and we'll settle this matter peacefully." Bo stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. At this distance, he was confident he could put a bullet through Morse's heart before the man could draw his weapon. But that would only start a war he couldn't finish, and Amara would pay the price for his revenge. "The woman is my wife," Bo called back. "Legally married under territorial law. She's not going anywhere." "Your wife?" Morse laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the morning air. "You can't marry property, boy, any more than you can marry a horse or a cow. That woman belongs to Jacob Morrison of Texas, who's been searching for his escaped property for 3 years. The name hit Bo like a physical blow. Morrison, the same name as the federal judge to whom they'd sent their evidence. Coincidence seemed unlikely in a territory where powerful men protected each other's interests through blood and marriage and mutual profit. "She belongs to herself," Bo replied, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "We'll see what the territorial courts have to say about that." Morse gestured toward one of his men, who rode forward carrying an official-looking document. "Federal warrant, signed by Judge Morrison himself. We're here on legal business, boy. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The warrant was probably genuine, Bo realized. Judge Morrison, if he was related to the Texas rancher who claimed to own Amara, would have had no trouble producing the legal documents necessary to reclaim escaped property. Their desperate gamble to use the law against their enemies had backfired spectacularly. "Bo," Amara's voice came from behind him, soft and steady. "It's time." He turned to find her standing in the doorway, and for a moment his breath caught in his throat. She'd changed from her everyday dress into something he'd never seen before, a white cotton gown with intricate embroidery along the sleeves and neckline. The kind of garment that spoke of wealth and education and a life before bondage. "My mother's wedding dress," she explained, smoothing the fabric with gentle hands. "I've been saving it for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to wear it again." "Amara, don't. They can take my freedom, they can take my life, but they can't take my dignity, and they can't make me ashamed of who I am." She stepped past him onto the porch, standing straight and proud in the morning sunlight. "I am Amara Delgado Laramie, daughter of Eduardo and Isabella Delgado, wife of Beaumont Laramie, and I will not hide from these men." The sight of Herrigal and defiant in her mother's dress, wearing his mother's ring, facing down 20 armed men with nothing but courage and conviction filled Bo with such fierce pride that he almost forgot the hopelessness of their situation. "Beautiful speech," Morse called out, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "But legal documents don't care about your dignity, girl. You're coming with us." "No," Amara said simply. "I'm not." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of Greek tragedy. Morse gestured to his men, several of whom began to dismount and check their weapons. At the same time, movement caught Bo's eye from the direction of town, another group of riders approaching fast, their horses' hooves throwing up a cloud of dust that turned the morning air hazy. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Reinforcements, perhaps. Father Miguel had convinced the townspeople to stand with them against injustice. But as the riders drew closer, Bo's hope curdled into despair. These weren't townspeople coming to help. They were federal marshals, complete with badges and authority and the full power of the territorial government behind them. Mr. Laramie. The lead marshal was a thin man, with cold eyes and a voice like winter wind. I'm Marshal Davidson. We're here to execute a federal warrant for the arrest of one Amara Santos, also known as Amara Delgado, on charges of theft of property and conspiracy to defraud. She's my wife, Bo said again, though the words felt hollow now. Bigamy is also a federal crime, Davidson replied without emotion. As is interfering with the lawful recovery of stolen property, I suggest you step aside and let us do our job. 20 armed men, federal marshals, legal warrants signed by a judge who might be in Clayton Morse's pocket. The odds had always been impossible, but now they were laughable. Bo felt the weight of his rifle in his hands and wondered if it would be better to die fighting than to live with the knowledge that he'd let them take her. Bo. Amara's hand touched his arm, and he looked down to see her smiling, actually smiling, as if she'd found something amusing in their desperate situation. Look. She was pointing past the marshals, past Morse's men, toward the valley road where yet another group of riders was approaching. But these weren't armed men or federal officials. They were families, Mexican farmers, Apache couples, even some of the white settlers who scratched out livings on the territory's margins. They carried no weapons, posed no threat, but they came anyway, drawn by some invisible summons, to witness what was about to unfold. They're not here to fight, Amara said softly. They're here to remember, to see what happens when power meets principle, when law meets justice. Among the gathering crowd, Bo spotted familiar faces. Maria Santos rode beside her nephews and cousins. Father Miguel sat his ancient burro, like a general surveying a battlefield. Even Sheriff Bradley was there, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what he was about to witness. "This is your last chance, Laramie," Morse called out, his patience finally wearing thin. "Send out the woman, or we'll come and take her." Bo looked at his wife, beautiful and brave in her mother's dress, wearing his mother's ring, standing ready to face whatever came with a dignity that no amount of force could diminish. Then he looked at the crowd of witnesses, these people who'd come to see whether justice could survive in a place where power had always made the rules. "Then come and take her," he said, raising his rifle. The first shot came from one of Morse's men, a nervous gunslinger who'd mistaken Bo's movement for aggression. The bullet splintered the porch rails 6 inches from where Amara stood, and suddenly the morning exploded into chaos. Bo's rifle spoke first, the heavy boom echoing across the valley like thunder. The man who'd fired the initial shot pitched backward from his horse, clutching his shoulder and screaming. But there was no time to assess the damage more. Shots rang out, and bullets began chewing chunks from the adobe walls of the house. "Get inside!" Bo shouted. But Amara was already moving, diving through the doorway as glass exploded from the front windows. The battle that followed was unlike anything Bo had experienced, even in his violent past. This wasn't a bar fight or a dispute over cards. This was warfare. Desperate and personal, and fought with the kind of intensity that only came when everything precious was at stake. From the front window, Bo laid down covering fire while Amara took position at the side window, her movements calm and precise despite the bullets whistling around them. She'd found his brother's old Colt revolver and was using it with surprising accuracy, forcing Morse's men to take cover behind their horses instead of advancing on the house. "Where did you learn to shoot?" Bo called out during a brief lull in the gunfire. "My father taught me," she replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "He said a woman in the territory needed to be able to protect herself." Outside, Marshal Davidson was shouting orders, trying to organize the chaos into something resembling a coordinated assault. But his federal authority meant little when bullets were flying, and Morse's hired guns were more interested in survival than following proper procedures. It was then that the unexpected happened. Father Miguel's voice rose above the gunfire, strong and clear as he began to sing not a hymn or a prayer, but an old Spanish song about justice and courage and standing against tyranny. One by one, the witnesses who'd gathered to watch the confrontation joined in, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to make the very air vibrate with defiance. The effect on Morse's men was immediate and profound. Several stopped shooting entirely, staring in confusion at the crowd of unarmed people who sang in the face of violence. Others began to look uncertain, as if they were beginning to question what they'd been hired to do. "Shut them up!" Morse screamed, his composure finally cracking. "Scatter that crowd!" But when two of his men turned their weapons toward the singing witnesses, something extraordinary happened. Sheriff Bradley rode forward, placing himself between the gunman and the crowd, his own weapon drawn and ready. "You fire on unarmed civilians, and you'll answer to me," the old lawman said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed frozen in tableau-hired guns, with weapons raised towards singing families, a sheriff ready to die, protecting them, and in the center of it all, Clayton Morse's carefully planned operation falling apart around him. It was Amara who broke the stalemate. She stepped out onto the porch, her white dress brilliant in the morning sunlight, and raised her hands for silence. Gradually the singing stopped, the shooting ceased, and an unnatural quiet settled over the valley. "Mr. Morse," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I have something that belongs to you." From the folds of her dress, she withdrew a folded paper knot, one of the documents they'd sent to Santa Fe, but something else, something that made Morse's face go white with shock. "This is the original deed to my father's land," she continued, holding the paper high so everyone could see it. "The deed that shows how you cheated my family, how you had my parents murdered, how you stole 800 acres of the richest grazing land in the territory." "That's impossible," Morse snarled, but his voice carried no conviction. "Those papers were destroyed years ago." "Were they? Or did you simply assume they were destroyed because my family was?" Amara's smile was sharp as winter wind. "My father was a careful man, Mr. Morse. He made copies of important documents, hid them in places where men like you would never think to look." The crowd stirred as her words sank in. Here was proof of what many had long suspected, that Clayton Morse's empire was built on theft and murder, that the most powerful man in the territory was nothing more than a common criminal with expensive clothes and political connections. "She's lying," Morse shouted, wheeling his horse toward the crowd. "Don't listen to her. She's a fugitive, a thief, a woman who—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Yet another group of riders was coming up the valley road, but these bore the uniforms and authority of the territorial militia. At their head rode a man Bo didn't recognize, a federal judge, by his bearing and the legal documents he carried. "I am Judge Harrison of the Federal District Court," the newcomer announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I'm here to investigate charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder in connection with the Delgado land case." The effect of his words was electric. Morse's hired guns began looking around nervously, suddenly aware that they might be on the wrong side of federal law. Marshal Davidson spurred his horse toward the judge, relief evident on his weathered face. "Judge Harrison, thank God, we have warrants to execute." "Warrants signed by Judge Morrison, I assume?" Harrison's voice was ice cold. "Judge Morrison, who is currently under investigation for corruption and conspiracy. Judge Morrison, whose financial records show suspicious payments from various parties in this territory." The bottom dropped out of Morse's world in that moment. Bo could see it in the rancher's face, the realization that his carefully constructed web of legal protection was unraveling, that the federal authorities he'd counted on to legitimize his crimes had been compromised. "The documents sent to my office tell a very different story than the warrants you carry," Judge Harrison continued, addressing Marshal Davidson. "They tell a story of systematic theft, of families murdered for their land, of a conspiracy that reaches from local ranchers to territorial judges." "Those documents are forgeries," Morse said desperately, "lies concocted by criminals and thieves." "Are they?" Judge Harrison gestured to one of his men, who produced a familiar-looking bundle of papers. "Then perhaps you can explain why these documents bear the seal of the Territorial Land Office, why they're signed by officials you yourself recommended for their positions, why they match perfectly with records we found in Judge Morrison's private files. The trap was closing around Clayton Morse like jaws of steel, and everyone present could see it happening. His hired guns were already beginning to edge away, unwilling to face federal charges for a man who could no longer protect them. Even Marshal Davidson was looking uncertain, his hand moving away from his weapon. But Morse himself wasn't finished. With the desperation of a cornered animal, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Amara. "I don't care about federal judges or legal documents," he snarled. "That woman has caused me more trouble than I'll tolerate. If I'm going down, she's coming with me." The moment stretched like a wire drawn too tight. Morse's finger tightened on the trigger. Bo raised his rifle, knowing he was too far away to stop what was about to happen. The crowd drew in a collective breath, and then Amara smiled. "Go ahead," she said calmly. "Pull the trigger. Murder me in front of all these witnesses, in front of a federal judge, in front of the very people you've been trying to control for years. Show them exactly what kind of man you really are." For a heartbeat, Morse hesitated. In that hesitation, Bo saw something break inside the rancher, the last pretense of respectability, the final illusion that he was anything more than a killer in expensive clothes. Morse's finger moved on the trigger, but before he could fire, Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Clayton Morse, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The old sheriff's gun was already drawn, already aimed at Morse's heart. Around him, Judge Harrison's men had their weapons ready as well. Morse was surrounded, outnumbered, and facing the choice between surrender and certain death. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the valley held its breath. Then, with infinite slowness, Clayton Morse lowered his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. The blood-stained legal deed, the final proof of land ownership that Amara clutched in her trembling hands, caught the morning sunlight and seemed to burn like a torch of justice, finally kindled after years of darkness. 6 months later, the church bells of Esperanza rang out across the valley, calling the faithful to witness a celebration that would be remembered for generations. Bo stood at the altar, wearing his father's best suit, carefully mended and pressed for the occasion, watching as his wife walked down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress, the same dress she'd worn to face down. Clayton Morse, now cleaned and carefully preserved as a symbol of courage, triumphing over cruelty. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows caught the simple gold band on her finger, his mother's ring that had finally found its true home. "Dearly beloved," Father Miguel began, his voice strong and joyful, "we are gathered here today to celebrate not just the union of two hearts, but the triumph of love over hatred, justice over oppression, hope over despair." This was their real wedding public, witnessed by the entire community, blessed by God, and celebrated by people who'd learned to believe in happy endings again. Their first ceremony had been born of desperation and fear. This one was born of joy and the certainty that they'd found in each other everything they'd ever hoped to find in this world. The congregation was unlike any wedding gathering the territory had ever seen. Maria Santos sat in the front pew beside her extended family, tears of happiness streaming down her weathered cheeks. Sheriff Bradley was there in his best clothes, his badge polished to a mirror shine. Judge Harrison had traveled from Santa Fe specifically for the occasion, bringing with him the final legal documents that confirmed Amara's ownership of her family's land. But it was the children who made the day truly special. 24 young faces, Mexican, Apache, and white filled the church pews, wearing their finest clothes and carrying flowers from Amara's garden. These were her students, the children she'd been teaching to read and write in the schoolhouse that now occupied the space where Clayton Morse's empire had once cast its shadow. The investigation that followed Morse's arrest had unraveled a conspiracy that reached all the way to Santa Fe and beyond. Judge Morrison was in federal prison, along with a territorial governor and 3 prominent businessmen who'd profited from the systematic theft of land from families too poor to fight back. Morse himself was serving life in prison, his vast holdings seized by the federal government and redistributed to their rightful owners. Do you, Beaumont Laramie, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do, Beau said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. I did 6 months ago, and I do again today, and I'll do it every day for the rest of my life. And do you, Amara Delgado Laramie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do, Amara replied, her eyes bright with tears of joy. I choose him today, as I chose him that first night on the porch, as I chose him when we faced down our enemies together, as I'll choose him every morning until my last breath. Then, by the power vested in me by Almighty God and the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together in love, let no man put asunder in hatred. The kiss that sealed their renewed vows was different from their first desperate embrace in this same church. This one was confident, joyful, flavored with the knowledge that they'd fought for their love and won against impossible odds. As they walked back down the aisle together, hands clasped and faces glowing with happiness, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. Rice flew through the air like snow, and somewhere in the back of the church, someone began playing a guitar while voices joined in a joyful song of celebration. Outside the church, the reception stretched across the plaza, with tables laden with food prepared by every family in the valley. There was Maria's famous tamales, Father Miguel's Spanish rice, even contributions from the Apache families who'd found in Amara's school a bridge between their world and the changing territory around them. To the bride and groom, Sheriff Bradley called out, raising a glass of Maria's potent sangria. To two people who proved that love is stronger than fear, that justice is stronger than power, and that sometimes the good guys really do win. The toast was echoed by dozens of voices, but it was a small voice from the front of the crowd that made Amara's heart swell with pride. Maestra Amara, called out little Rosa Delgado, one of her newest students. Tell us the story again. Tell us how you and Senor Beau beat the bad men. Stories are for later, mija, Amara laughed, bending down to hug the girl. Today is for dancing and eating and celebrating. But even as she spoke, she caught Beau's eye and saw the same thought reflected there. They would tell the story tonight, around the fire, with their students gathered close and the stars wheeling overhead. They would tell it honestly, without making themselves into heroes they'd never claimed to be, but as a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose love over fear. The afternoon melted into evening with the kind of perfect timing that made it seem as if God himself was blessing their celebration. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that turned the desert into a cathedral of light, the mariachi band that had come all the way from Albuquerque struck up a waltz. Beau led his wife onto the makeshift dance floor, his large hands gentle on her waist as they moved together with the easy grace of two people who'd learned to read each other's thoughts. Around them, other couples joined in, young and old, rich and poor, Mexican and Anglo and Apache, all dancing together under the vast New Mexico sky. Happy? Beau asked as they swayed to the music. More than I ever thought possible, Amara replied, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. Do you remember what you asked me that first night? What I hoped for? You said you hoped I wasn't my brother. I was wrong. I should have hoped for something bigger. She looked up at him with eyes that sparkled like the first stars beginning to appear overhead. I should have hoped that you'd be exactly who you area man, who chooses to protect instead of control, who builds instead of destroys, who loves instead of fears. And you, Beau said, spinning her gently as the music swelled, are exactly what I never knew I was looking for. My teacher, my partner, my conscience, my heart. As the dance ended and the evening began to settle into the comfortable rhythm of family celebration, they found themselves surrounded by the life they'd built together. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the plaza, its windows glowing with lamplight, where some of the older students were practicing their letters. The ranch sprawled beyond the town, prosperous and well-managed under their joint ownership. And everywhere they looked, they saw faces that had become dear to them, friends who'd stood with them, students who trusted them, families who'd found hope in their example. Later that night, as the last guests departed and the plaza emptied under a canopy of stars, Bo and Amara walked hand in hand back to their ranch. The house had been expanded since their confrontation with more new rooms for the children they hoped to have, a larger kitchen where they could host the community meals that had become a tradition, a study where Amara could prepare her lessons and Bo could manage the business of the ranch. But it was the porch that remained their favorite place, the setting for so many conversations and revelations and quiet moments of connection. They settled into their chairs, the same chairs where they'd first spoken of love, where they'd planned their fight against injustice, where they'd dreamed of the future they were now living. "Tell me about our children," Amara said, the same request she'd made on the night before their first confrontation with Morse's men. "Eduardo will be tall like his father, but gentle like his grandfather," Bo replied, settling into the familiar game they played. "He'll learn to read from his mother and to work the land from his father, and he'll grow up knowing that his family name stands for justice. And hope? Hope will be brilliant like her mother, with eyes that see straight to the truth of things. She'll attend university, maybe in Santa Fe, maybe even back east, and she'll come home to teach the next generation of children that education is the one gift no one can steal. And they'll sit on this porch with their own children someday," Amara added, "and tell them stories about their grandparents who loved each other enough to change the world." As if summoned by their words, the sound of a baby's cry drifted from the house, not their baby, not yet, but the infant son of Rosa Delgado's older sister, whose family was staying with them while their new home was being built on land that had been restored to their ownership. "Our turn will come," Amara said softly, and Bo heard in her voice the same certainty that had carried them through their darkest moments. "Soon," he agreed, pulling her closer as a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and new growth across the valley. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the peaceful sounds of the desert at night. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere a nightbird answered with a song that seemed to celebrate the simple miracle of love surviving in a harsh world. The worn shawl that had first symbolized Amara's endurance now hung in their bedroom, carefully preserved as a reminder of how far they'd traveled from that first meeting on the porch. His mother's ring caught the starlight, no longer a symbol of what had been lost, but of what had been found and cherished and passed on. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, children to teach, land to tend, a community to nurture and protect. But tonight they were simply husband and wife, sitting together on their porch, carrying each other through another peaceful evening in the life they'd built with courage and defended with love. "No regrets?" Bo asked, echoing the question he'd posed on the night before their final confrontation. "Only that we can't live this life twice," Amara replied, and her smile was radiant in the starlight. And as the desert wind whispered through the sage and the mountains stood sentinel over the valley they'd claimed as home, Bo Laramie carried his wife across the threshold, one more Timano, because she needed carrying, but because some gestures were too precious to be abandoned, some traditions too meaningful to be forgotten. They were exactly where they belonged, exactly who they'd fought to become, exactly as happy as two people could be, who'd learned that true strength meant choosing love over power every single day for the rest of their lives.